It begins with silence, a silence that once followed the roar of bombs, the cries of families torn apart, and the crackle of radio broadcasts echoing across continents. It is a silence heavy with memory, filled with the weight of choices made and unmade, battles fought and lost, and futures forever altered. World War II was not just a conflict of armies, but a war of ideologies, of nations, and of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Its aftermath reshaped the modern world, carving out the boundaries of nations, the rise of superpowers, and the fragile promise of peace that still governs our lives today. Hello and welcome to the Other Side Stories. Here, we travel beyond the usual headlines to explore the untold tales of world history, mysteries, turning points, and hidden connections that shaped our planet. If you love discovering how the past still echoes in our present, you're in the right place. Let's uncover the other side of history together. When we think of World War II, the images that come to mind are often stark and unforgettable. Mushroom clouds rising over Hiroshima, soldiers storming the beaches of Normandy, or Adolf Hitler delivering speeches that would ignite one of humanity's darkest chapters. But behind those iconic scenes lies a web of lesser-known stories. The struggles of small resistance groups, the whispers of diplomats trying to avoid catastrophe, and the millions of civilians whose lives were overturned in the blink of an eye. The origins of the war trace back to the unresolved tensions of World War I. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was intended to bring peace, but instead it planted seeds of resentment. Germany was burdened with heavy reparations, stripped of territory, and forced to accept responsibility for the Great War. For the German people, it was humiliation on a national scale, fueling anger and economic despair during the 1920s and early 1930s. Out of this turmoil rose Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, who promised to restore pride, strength, and prosperity. Across Europe, similar storms were brewing. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, embraced fascism and expansionist dreams. Japan, hungry for resources and empire, turned its ambitions toward Asia and the Pacific. Meanwhile, the world's democracies, France, Britain, and later the United States, were weary of war and hesitant to intervene in foreign conflicts. The stage was set for confrontation. By the late 1930s, Hitler had already defied the Treaty of Versailles by rebuilding Germany's military and annexing territories such as Austria in 1938. Britain and France, desperate to avoid another bloodbath, followed a policy of appeasement, most famously at the Munich Conference, where they allowed Hitler to occupy the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia in exchange for his promise of peace. It was a promise soon broken. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Just 2 days later, Britain and France declared war, marking the official start of World War II. What began as a European conflict would soon engulf the entire globe. The war unfolded in multiple theaters: Europe, North Africa, the Atlantic, and the Pacific. In Europe, German forces pioneered the tactic known as Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, combining fast-moving tanks, aircraft, and infantry to overwhelm enemies before they could react. Within weeks, Poland had fallen. In the following months, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France would also succumb to Nazi conquest. By June 1940, Britain stood alone against the German war machine. The Battle of Britain became the first major turning point. German planes filled the skies, bombing cities and military targets in a campaign of terror known as the Blitz. Londoners huddled in underground stations, children were evacuated to the countryside, and the Royal Air Force fought desperately in the air. Against the odds, Britain held firm, and Hitler's plans to invade the island were abandoned. Meanwhile, in the east, another storm was brewing. In June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history, against the Soviet Union. Millions of German troops surged across the frontier, aiming to crush the Soviets before winter. At first, the offensive was devastating, but as the months dragged on, German forces became bogged down. The brutal winter, fierce resistance, and the vastness of Soviet territory turned the tide. The battles of Moscow, Stalingrad, and later Kursk would prove decisive, costing millions of lives but breaking the momentum of the Nazi advance. While Europe burned, Japan pursued its own path of aggression in Asia. Having occupied Manchuria in 1931 and invaded China in 1937, Japanese forces sought dominance across the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, drawing the United States into the war. Overnight, a regional conflict became a truly global struggle. The American entry shifted the balance of power. With its vast industrial capacity, the United States began producing ships, planes, and weapons at a scale unmatched by any other nation. The arsenal of democracy, as President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it, supplied not only American forces but allies across the globe. As the years wore on, the war reached a crescendo of destruction. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Millions of Jews, along with Romani people, political prisoners, disabled individuals, and others, were systematically murdered in the Holocaust, an industrialized genocide unlike anything the world had ever seen. Resistance movements rose within occupied countries, but they often faced brutal reprisals. Ordinary people, caught in the crossfire, endured hunger, fear, and unimaginable loss. By 1943 and 1944, the tide was turning. In North Africa, Allied forces defeated German and Italian troops, paving the way for the invasion of Italy. Mussolini's regime collapsed, and Italy switched sides. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history, storming the beaches of Normandy. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. The Eastern Front, meanwhile, became a graveyard for Hitler's ambitions. The Soviet Red Army pushed relentlessly westward, reclaiming territory and advancing toward Berlin. The sheer scale of the fighting was staggering. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and entire cities laid waste. In the Pacific, the United States adopted a strategy of island hopping, capturing key islands while bypassing heavily fortified positions. The battles of Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa showcased both the ferocity of Japanese resistance and the determination of American forces. Each victory brought the Allies closer to Japan's home islands, but at an enormous human cost. By May 1945, Germany was finished. Hitler had taken his own life in his Berlin bunker, and Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally. Across Europe, people celebrated victory. But the scars of war were everywhere: destroyed cities, displaced millions, and families torn apart. The war in Asia, however, raged on. The planned invasion of Japan promised to be one of the bloodiest campaigns in history. But in August 1945, the world witnessed a new and terrifying weapon. The United States dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands instantly and forcing Japan to surrender. World War II was over. Yet the end of the war didn't mean the end of struggle. The aftermath was complex and profound. Europe lay in ruins, economies shattered, and millions displaced. The Holocaust revealed horrors that shocked the conscience of humanity, leading to the Nuremberg trials and the establishment of principles of international justice. Nations sought to rebuild, but new rivalries quickly emerged. The United States and the Soviet Union, once allies, now faced each other as superpowers with conflicting ideologies. Decolonization movements swept across Asia and Africa as former colonies demanded independence. The United Nations was established in 1945 with the hope of preventing another global catastrophe, yet the world remained fragile and divided. World War II was more than just a clash of armies. It was a crucible that reshaped politics, economy, society, and culture on a global scale. Its legacies, both painful and inspiring, continue to shape our world today. And yet, the stories of the war are not only about destruction. They are also about resilience, courage, and the human capacity to endure. From the diaries of Anne Frank to the defiance of resistance fighters, from the innovations of radar and penicillin to the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the aftermath of World War II gave birth to new ways of thinking, living, and connecting as a global community. As we continue this journey, let us look closer at how the war's aftermath unfolded, the rebuilding of nations, the shifting of borders, and the human experiences that defined an era where hope and fear walked hand in hand. The guns had fallen silent, but the echoes of war reverberated across the globe. In 1945, the world stood at a crossroads, devastation on an unimaginable scale, yet also the possibility of a new beginning. For those who had survived, the immediate aftermath was defined by ruins, cities bombed beyond recognition, industries reduced to rubble, and millions of displaced persons wandering the roads of Europe and Asia, searching for family, for food, for home. In Germany, scenes of utter collapse greeted the occupying Allied forces. Berlin was a shell of its former self, scarred by months of aerial bombardment and the final desperate battles of the Nazi regime. Ordinary Germans faced hunger, homelessness, and the psychological weight of defeat. For many, the realization of their government's crimes, the death camps, the genocide, the forced labor, was overwhelming. The Allies divided Germany into 4 occupation zones, administered by the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and later France. What began as a temporary arrangement would soon harden into the Cold War division of East and West. Meanwhile, across the continent, survivors of concentration camps stumbled back into the world, skeletal and traumatized. The liberation of Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and countless other camps revealed horrors that even hardened soldiers could scarcely comprehend. Piles of shoes, eyeglasses, and children's toys testified to the scale of the Holocaust. In displaced persons camps, survivors tried to rebuild shattered lives, while many sought new beginnings in Palestine, the United States, or other lands willing to accept refugees. The Allies convened the Nuremberg trials in 1945 and 1946, seeking justice for crimes against humanity. Leading Nazi officials stood before an international tribunal, accused of orchestrating genocide and waging aggressive war. For the first time in history, individuals, not just states, were held accountable under international law. Some were sentenced to death, others to prison. The trials established precedents that still guide our understanding of war crimes and human rights today. Reconstruction was not only a matter of justice, but survival. Across Western Europe, governments faced the monumental task of rebuilding infrastructure, restoring economies, and providing for their citizens. The United States launched the Marshall Plan in 1948, offering billions in aid to help Europe recover. Roads, factories, and schools were rebuilt with American funds and expertise. But the plan was also a strategic measure to prevent the spread of communism by stabilizing capitalist democracies. The Soviet Union, devastated by the war with an estimated 27 million dead, pursued its own path of reconstruction. Under Joseph Stalin, Eastern Europe was drawn into the Soviet sphere of influence. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany became socialist states aligned with Moscow. The Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill famously called it, had descended across Europe, dividing East from West. For ordinary people, the aftermath meant both hardship and change. Women, who had filled factories, farms, and offices during the war, now faced pressure to return to domestic roles. Yet many resisted, and the war had permanently shifted gender expectations in many societies. The GI Bill in the United States opened new opportunities for veterans, granting them education and housing benefits that fueled the post-war economic boom. The baby boom generation was born, marking a demographic shift that would shape culture and politics for decades. But not all post-war transitions were smooth. In Asia, the defeat of Japan left a power vacuum that ignited new struggles. In China, the civil war between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists resumed with ferocity. By 1949, Mao declared the founding of the People's Republic of China, reshaping the global balance of power. Korea, divided at the 38th parallel into Soviet and American zones, became another flashpoint that would soon erupt into war. Japan itself underwent a profound transformation under American occupation. General Douglas MacArthur oversaw reforms that dismantled Japan's military, established democratic institutions, and introduced a new constitution in 1947. Land reforms redistributed property, while economic restructuring laid the foundations for Japan's eventual rise as an economic powerhouse. Yet the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki lingered, shaping Japan's post-war identity as a nation determined to avoid future conflict. The global colonial order also began to unravel in the wake of World War II. European empires, weakened by war and facing nationalist movements, struggled to maintain control. In India, Mahatma Gandhi's campaign of nonviolent resistance reached its climax, and in 1947, Britain granted independence to India and Pakistan. Across Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, movements for self-determination gathered strength. The war had exposed the contradictions of imperial powers, preaching democracy abroad while ruling colonies at home. At the same time, the creation of the United Nations in 1945 reflected humanity's yearning for peace and cooperation. 50 nations gathered in San Francisco to sign the UN Charter, establishing an organization dedicated to preventing future wars, promoting human rights, and fostering international cooperation. The UN would play a central role in peacekeeping, refugee assistance, and global development, though its effectiveness often depended on the willingness of great powers to cooperate. Yet cooperation was increasingly scarce. By the late 1940s, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a rivalry that shaped every aspect of international politics. The arms race, the Berlin blockade, the formation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact all were direct consequences of the unresolved tensions of the post-war world. The victory over fascism had given way to a new and dangerous confrontation, the Cold War. Still, amid geopolitical struggles, ordinary lives moved forward. In the ruins of Warsaw, people rebuilt their homes brick by brick. In France and Italy, artists and writers grappled with existential questions born of war's devastation. In the United States, suburban neighborhoods sprouted seemingly overnight, offering veterans and their families a vision of stability and prosperity. The scars of war were deep, but so too was the human will to recover. The cultural aftermath of the war was equally profound. Films like Casablanca and The Best Years of Our Lives reflected both the romance and the trauma of wartime experience. Literature from authors like Primo Levi and Anne Frank gave voice to suffering and resilience. Music shifted too, as jazz spread across the globe, and later rock and roll emerged, in part from wartime cultural exchanges. Science and technology, accelerated by wartime demands, reshaped civilian life. The development of radar, antibiotics like penicillin, and the jet engine transformed medicine, travel, and industry. The atomic bomb, however, cast a shadow over progress, reminding humanity that its capacity for invention could bring both salvation and annihilation. In the Soviet Union, the cult of victory became central to national identity. Streets were renamed, monuments erected, and May 9th declared Victory Day. Yet behind the triumphs lay grief. Entire villages wiped out, families shattered, and a society scarred by both war and Stalinist repression. In America, victory fueled confidence and a sense of exceptionalism, but also anxieties about communism and the possibility of nuclear war. As decades passed, memories of the war were preserved in memorials, museums, and history books, but also in the quiet recollections of veterans and survivors. Their stories remind us that the war was not an abstract geopolitical struggle, but a lived experience of hunger, loss, love, and endurance. The aftermath of World War II was, in many ways, as defining the war itself. Borders shifted, empires crumbled, superpowers rose, and a new world order took shape. The choices made in those years about justice, reconstruction, and international cooperation continue to influence our present world. The world that emerged was not perfect, but it was profoundly different from the one that entered the war in 1939. As we continue to journey through this story, let us look more closely at the personal dimensions of the aftermath, the lives of displaced persons, the struggles of nations seeking independence, and the quiet acts of rebuilding that laid the groundwork for our modern world. When the dust of war settled, the question remained, how do you rebuild not just buildings and roads, but societies, identities, and trust among nations? For millions, the aftermath of World War II was not simply about surviving, it was about redefining what it meant to live in a changed world. In the ruins of Europe, people faced hunger on a massive scale. Rationing continued for years after the war's end, even in victorious countries like Britain. Bread, meat, and fuel were scarce, and citizens endured shortages well into the 1950s. Black markets thrived as desperate families sought to fill gaps left by government rations. In many places, cigarettes became a form of currency more valuable than money. Germany faced particularly dire conditions. Cities like Dresden, Cologne, and Hamburg were reduced to rubble. Infrastructure had collapsed, and millions were homeless. The Allied occupations sought to denazify society, removing former Nazi officials from positions of power and re-educating the population. But rebuilding a moral compass was as difficult as reconstructing buildings. For many Germans, especially children born during the war, there was an unspoken silence surrounding the atrocities of the regime. It would take decades for a full reckoning to emerge. The Marshall Plan marked a turning point. Officially known as the European Recovery Program, it pumped nearly $13 billion into Western Europe between 1948 and 1951. The aid funded new machinery, rebuilt factories, and restored confidence. Within a few years, economies were recovering, consumer goods were back on shelves, and a sense of stability returned. Yet this was not charity alone. It was also a weapon in the ideological struggle with the Soviet Union. Where American aid flowed, Western-style democracy and capitalism were encouraged. In Eastern Europe, the story was very different. Stalin rejected Marshall Plan aid for Soviet-controlled countries, fearing it would undermine communist ideology. Instead, the Soviet Union imposed central planning, collectivization, and strict political control. Secret police, censorship, and purges ensured loyalty. Resistance movements were crushed, and dissent was punished. The division of Europe hardened, with the Iron Curtain becoming both a physical and symbolic boundary between competing worldviews. The Berlin blockade of 1948 highlighted the growing rift. When the Soviets cut off access to West Berlin in an attempt to force the Allies out, the United States and Britain responded with the Berlin airlift. For nearly a year, cargo planes flew day and night, delivering food, coal, and supplies to the isolated city. The success of the airlift was a triumph of determination and logistics, but it also underscored the fragility of peace in post-war Europe. Beyond Europe, the ripples of war transformed the global order. Colonial subjects who had fought and died for European powers demanded recognition. In Africa, returning soldiers asked why they had defended freedom abroad while living under colonial rule at home. In Southeast Asia, nationalist movements intensified. In Indonesia, Sukarno declared independence in 1945, sparking a 4-year struggle against the Dutch. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed independence from France, setting the stage for decades of conflict. The Middle East also entered a new era. The horrors of the Holocaust, combined with long-standing Zionist aspirations, intensified efforts to create a Jewish homeland. In 1948, the State of Israel was declared, leading to war with neighboring Arab states. The conflict displaced hundreds of Palestinians, creating one of the most enduring and contentious struggles of the modern era. Meanwhile, in Asia, the human toll of the war was staggering. China had suffered over a decade of Japanese aggression, leaving millions dead and infrastructure in ruins. The civil war between nationalists and communists intensified, culminating in Mao Zedong's victory in 1949. The establishment of the People's Republic of China marked a seismic shift in global politics, as the world's most populous nation joined the communist camp. Japan's post-war experience was unique. Under U.S. occupation, the nation adopted a pacifist constitution, renouncing war as a sovereign right. American reforms dismantled feudal land structures, empowered labor unions, and introduced democratic governance. Though initially impoverished, Japan quickly rebuilt, fueled by American aid and its people's resilience. Within a generation, it would rise as one of the world's leading economies, symbolizing the transformative potential of post-war reconstruction. For individuals, however, the struggle was deeply personal. Families searched for missing loved ones, often in vain. Soldiers returning from the front faced reintegration into societies that could never fully understand their trauma. In the Soviet Union, veterans known as frontoviki were celebrated as heroes, yet many lived with invisible wounds. In the United States, returning GIs found opportunity but also struggled with memories of combat. Post-traumatic stress, though not fully understood at the time, shaped countless lives. The cultural landscape of the post-war world reflected these experiences. Literature became a vehicle for grappling with loss and meaning. George Orwell's 1984, published in 1949, reflected anxieties about totalitarianism, surveillance, and the fragility of freedom. Albert Camus' The Plague captured the existential dread of a world scarred by catastrophe. In art, abstract expressionism flourished in the United States, with artists like Jackson Pollock redefining creativity as a response to chaos. The Holocaust, in particular, left a profound mark on human consciousness. Survivors like Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi bore witness through memoirs that insisted the world must never forget. The phrase "never again" became a moral rallying cry, though history would tragically show that genocide did not end with the Nazis. Still, the Nuremberg trials established a framework for accountability, inspiring later efforts to create institutions like the International Criminal Court. The atomic bomb also redefined humanity's relationship with technology and power. For the first time, humans possessed the ability to annihilate entire cities in an instant. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki left survivors, known as hibakusha, with lasting scars, both physical and emotional. Their testimonies, often shared decades later, warned of the moral and existential dangers of nuclear weapons. The arms race between the US and the Soviet Union meant that nuclear annihilation loomed as a constant shadow over the post-war generation. Yet, amid fears, hope endured. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United States in 1948, articulated a vision of dignity, freedom, and equality for all people. It was a response to the atrocities of the war, an attempt to codify principles that could guide a better world. Though not always honored in practice, its influence has been immense, shaping international law, activism, and movements for justice. The aftermath of World War II also transformed everyday life in ways often overlooked. Technology advanced during the war found civilian applications. Radar contributed to aviation safety. Penicillin revolutionized medicine, saving countless lives. Developments in computing laid the groundwork for the digital age. Even instant coffee and nylon stockings, products of wartime innovation, became symbols of modern convenience in the post-war years. The post-war years were filled with contradictions, suffering and prosperity, fear and hope, division and unity. They were years when humanity stood on a knife's edge, trying to learn from the past while navigating an uncertain future. And as we move forward in this journey, we will look more closely at how nations carried the weight of memory, how new alliances and rivalries shaped decades to come, and how individuals, through resilience, creativity, and determination, sought to build lives from the ruins of war. In the years following 1945, the world became a laboratory of experiments, political, social, and cultural. Out of the ashes of war, societies tested new ways of living, while governments experimented with new forms of power. For some, the aftermath brought liberation and opportunity. For others, it meant repression, fear, and the tightening grip of authoritarian regimes. One of the most visible experiments was the reimagining of Europe. West Germany, rebuilt with American aid and guided by democratic institutions, emerged as an economic powerhouse. The Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, transformed cities once filled with rubble into modern hubs of commerce and culture. The Volkswagen Beetle, affordable and reliable, became a symbol of recovery. Factories churned out goods not only for Germans, but for export, fueling prosperity and creating a middle class that had once seemed impossible after 1945. In contrast, East Germany developed under Soviet control into a society defined by state surveillance and centralized planning. The Stasi, East Germany's secret police, became notorious for infiltrating nearly every aspect of daily life. Neighbors spied on neighbors, and suspicion lingered like a fog. Yet even within repression, people found ways to adapt, through small acts of resistance, humor, or quiet defiance. This contrast between East and West Germany would remain one of the starkest symbols of the post-war world. Britain, though victorious, faced its own challenges. The war had drained its economy, leaving the nation heavily indebted. The empire, once spanning the globe, began to dissolve. India's independence in 1947 marked the beginning of a cascade of decolonization. In the years that followed, colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia sought self-rule. While some transitions were relatively peaceful, others were violent and fraught with bloodshed. Britain redefined itself from an imperial power to a welfare state, introducing the National Health Service in 1948 and expanding social programs to support citizens. France, too, faced both humiliation and rebirth. The memory of occupation and collaboration with Nazi Germany haunted the nation, but the resistance myth gave citizens a narrative of pride and unity. Under Charles de Gaulle, France sought to reclaim its position as a global power, balancing between American influence and national independence. Yet France also faced colonial struggles, particularly in Indochina and Algeria, where wars of independence would leave deep scars. For the Soviet Union, the aftermath of the war was paradoxical. On the one hand, it emerged as a superpower, commanding influence across Eastern Europe and basking in the glory of victory. On the other, the human cost was staggering. Entire villages erased, millions dead, and cities like Stalingrad reduced to rubble. Stalin tightened his control, launching purges and enforcing conformity. Propaganda glorified sacrifice, but behind the facade, fear and suffering remained. Still, Soviet achievements in science and industry, culminating in the launch of Sputnik in 1957, projected power and prestige on a global scale. The United States entered a golden age of prosperity. Its mainland had been untouched by war, and its industries had grown stronger. Suburban neighborhoods sprang up, filled with identical houses, new appliances, and cars in every driveway. The GI Bill provided education for veterans, fueling an explosion of universities and skilled workers. Yet prosperity was not universal. Racial segregation persisted, particularly in the American South. African American veterans who had fought for freedom abroad returned to discrimination at home, planting the seeds of the civil rights movement that would blossom in the 1950s and 1960s. Culture, too, was transformed. Hollywood expanded its global reach, exporting not only films, but an entire vision of the American dream. Movies portrayed heroes, romance, and the triumph of good over evil, offering escapism and inspiration. Television entered homes, becoming a new medium of storytelling and propaganda. Advertisements shaped desires, and consumer culture became a defining feature of post-war life. At the same time, the shadow of nuclear war colored every aspect of existence. In schools, children practiced duck and cover drills, crouching under desks in preparation for an attack that in reality no desk could protect them from. Governments built fallout shelters. Scientists debated the morality of their creations. The atomic age had arrived, and with it came both wonder at technological progress and terror at its destructive potential. Beyond the superpowers, nations across the globe grappled with their own transformations. In Italy, the fall of Mussolini led to the birth of a republic. Political divisions between communists, socialists, and conservatives created turbulence, but democracy endured. In Greece, civil war broke out between royalists and communists, drawing in foreign powers and foreshadowing the global Cold War struggle. In Asia, Korea became one of the first battlegrounds of the New World Order. Divided at the 38th parallel, tensions exploded in 1950 when North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, invaded the South. The Korean War drew in the United States and United Nations forces, resulting in a brutal stalemate that left millions dead and the peninsula divided to this day. It was a stark reminder that the aftermath of World War II was not peace, but a shifting of conflict into new arenas. Vietnam, too, emerged from World War II into a struggle for independence. Ho Chi Minh, who had declared independence in 1945, faced French attempts to reassert colonial control. The First Indochina War culminated in the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, paving the way for American involvement in the years to come. Once again, the legacy of World War II intertwined with the battles of decolonization and Cold War rivalry. The Middle East was similarly reshaped. The creation of Israel in 1948 was both a response to the Holocaust and a continuation of long-standing tensions in the region. For Jews, it represented refuge and rebirth. For Palestinians, it was the beginning of displacement and exile. Wars between Israel and its neighbors erupted repeatedly in the decades that followed, making the region one of the most volatile legacies of the war's aftermath. Africa, still under colonial rule in the late 1940s, saw rising tides of nationalism. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya drew inspiration from global calls for freedom and self-determination. The war had shown that European powers were not invincible, and the struggle for independence would soon sweep the continent. The Middle East was similarly reshaped. The creation of Israel in 1948 was both a response to the Holocaust and a continuation of long-standing tensions in the region. For Jews, it represented refuge and rebirth. For Palestinians, it was the beginning of displacement and exile. Wars between Israel and its neighbors erupted repeatedly in the decades that followed, making the region one of the most volatile legacies of the war's aftermath. Africa, still under colonial in the late 1940s, saw rising tides of nationalism. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya drew inspiration from global calls for freedom and self-determination. The war had shown that European powers were not invincible, and the struggle for independence would soon sweep the continent. The Middle East was similarly reshaped. The creation of Israel in 1948 was both a response to the Holocaust and a continuation of long-standing tensions in the region. For Jews, it represented refuge and rebirth. For Palestinians, it was the beginning of displacement and exile. Wars between Israel and its neighbors erupted repeatedly in the decades that followed, making the region one of the most volatile legacies of the war's aftermath. Africa, still under colonial in the late 1940s, saw rising tides of nationalism. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya drew inspiration from global calls for freedom and self-determination. The war had shown that European powers were not invincible, and the struggle for independence would soon sweep the continent. The Middle East was similarly reshaped. The creation of Israel in 1948 was both a response to the Holocaust and a continuation of long-standing tensions in the region. For Jews, it represented refuge and rebirth. For Palestinians, it was the beginning of displacement and exile. Wars between Israel and its neighbors erupted repeatedly in the decades that followed, making the region one of the most volatile legacies of the war's aftermath. Africa, still under colonial in the late 1940s, saw rising tides of nationalism. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya drew inspiration from global calls for freedom and self-determination. The war had shown that European powers were not invincible, and the struggle for independence would soon sweep the continent. The Middle East was similarly reshaped. The creation of Israel in 1948 was both a response to the Holocaust and a continuation of long-standing tensions in the region. For Jews, it represented refuge and rebirth. For Palestinians, it was the beginning of displacement and exile. Wars between Israel and its neighbors erupted repeatedly in the decades that followed. The Middle East was similarly reshaped. The creation of Israel in 1948 was both a response to the Holocaust and a continuation of long-standing tensions in the region. For Jews, it represented refuge and rebirth. For Palestinians, it was the beginning of displacement and exile. Wars between Israel and its neighbors erupted repeatedly in the decades that followed. The Middle East was similarly reshaped. As the decades unfolded, the legacies of World War II continued to shape every corner of the globe. The war had been both an end and a beginning, an end to old empires, old ideologies, and old certainties, and a beginning of new struggles, new aspirations, and new dangers. The aftermath was not a single moment, but a long, unfolding process that extended into the second half of the 20th century and beyond. One of the clearest legacies was the division of the world into two opposing blocs. The Cold War was the child of World War II, born from both cooperation and mistrust between the United States and the Soviet Union. Allies in war, they became adversaries in peace. Nuclear weapons defined their rivalry, turning deterrence into a grim equation of mutually assured destruction. The Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, all were echoes of decisions and divisions that emerged from 1945. Yet, the Cold War was not only about bombs and politics, it was also about ideas, culture, and influence. Jazz, jeans, and Hollywood films became symbols of freedom in Eastern Europe. Soviet space triumphs, like Yuri Gagarin's journey into orbit, became sources of pride for communists worldwide. Schools, universities, and communities became arenas of ideological competition, where visions of the future were tested against one another. The war's end had not brought harmony, but it had created a new global stage where superpowers performed for the world. Meanwhile, the decolonization process accelerated. Across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, new nations emerged, carrying the hopes and burdens of self-rule. India and Pakistan's independence inspired others. Ghana, Algeria, Kenya, Nigeria, and dozens more would follow in the coming decades. These nations carried scars of war, colonization, and internal conflict, but their struggles were also expressions of resilience and determination. The map of the world was redrawn, not by bombs, but by voices demanding freedom. In Europe, integration emerged as a surprising answer to war's devastation. Leaders like Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet envisioned a continent bound not by rivalry, but by cooperation. The European Coal and Steel Community, created in 1951, was designed to tie together industries essential for war, coal and steel, so that future conflict between France and Germany would be unthinkable. Out of these early steps grew the European Union, a bold experiment in unity that transformed a continent once divided by trenches and battlefields. Japan, too, charted a remarkable path. From ruins in 1945, it rebuilt into a nation of technological innovation and cultural influence. Its post-war constitution, written under U.S. supervision, emphasized pacifism, democracy, and human rights. By the 1960s, Japan was hosting the Olympics and exporting electronics and cars across the globe. The Japanese miracle showed how resilience and adaptation could turn defeat into strength. The cultural memory of the war remained vivid. In Germany, the silence of the immediate post-war years gave way to a painful reckoning in the 1960s and beyond. Memorials, trials of former Nazis, and education about the Holocaust became central to national identity. In Japan, debates about wartime responsibility continued, particularly regarding atrocities committed in Asia. In the Soviet Union, the war was remembered as the Great Patriotic War, celebrated for its victories while obscuring the suffering caused by Stalin's regime. In the United States, the narrative of the Good War reinforced pride and unity, though it often overlooked the complexity of racial inequality and dissent. Generations born after the war inherited both its burdens and its lessons. The baby boomers came of age in a world of prosperity but also fear, shaped by the optimism of peace and the anxieties of nuclear confrontation. For them, the memory of World War II was a constant presence through films, television, veteran stories, and the monuments that dotted landscapes from Normandy to Hiroshima. Science and technology advanced rapidly in the post-war decades, fueled by wartime innovation. The race to space, computers, medical breakthroughs all had roots in the war. The very tools once built for destruction were redirected toward exploration, communication, and healing. Yet, the dual nature of science, its ability to create and to destroy, remained a constant reminder of the moral dilemmas born in 1945. Even the environment bore the marks of the war. Entire forests had been destroyed, landscapes scarred by bombs and trenches. The atomic bomb left radiation and devastation in Japan, creating new understandings of environmental and human health. In the decades after the war, growing awareness of ecological fragility became another indirect legacy, as humanity reflected on its power to alter not just societies, but the very planet itself. The 20th century's second half was shaped by questions raised in 1945. How can peace be preserved? How can justice be achieved? How can humanity prevent such destruction from happening again? Institutions like the United Nations sought answers, with varying degrees of success. Peacekeeping missions, human rights declarations, and international treaties were imperfect but necessary attempts to build a framework stronger than violence. And yet, wars did not end. From Korea to Vietnam, from the Middle East to Africa, conflict remained part of human life. The memory of World War II did not prevent future bloodshed, but it did provide lessons, warnings, and examples of resilience. The phrase "never again," born out of the Holocaust, became a moral touchstone, even as humanity sometimes failed to live up to it. Today, more than 75 years later, the Second World War remains one of the most studied, remembered, and debated events in history. Its images, the mushroom cloud, the liberation of camps, the raising of flags on battlefields, still haunt and inspire. Its lessons about the dangers of extremism, the fragility of peace, and the resilience of the human spirit still resonate. The aftermath of World War II was not simply about rebuilding what had been lost. It was about redefining what humanity could become. It was about creating institutions to safeguard peace, reimagining societies, and carrying forward the stories of those who lived, fought, and died. It was about memory, responsibility, and hope. As we reflect on this chapter of history, we see that the war's legacy is all around us, in the shape of nations, in the alliances we rely on, in the technologies we use, and in the cultural memories we share. To understand our present is to recognize the echoes of that war and to honor the resilience of those who endured it. The world after 1945 was not perfect, and it remains imperfect still. But it was profoundly changed, shaped by the choices of leaders, the struggles of nations, and the courage of ordinary people. The aftermath of World War II is in truth still unfolding today. Thanks for watching The Other Side Stories. If you enjoyed this journey through history's hidden paths, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow explorers. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Until next time, keep wondering about the past that shapes our future.